Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Ginetta Candelario, and we are in the final panel of our day 2 of Meridians 20th anniversary celebration. As I'm sure you all know, this panel is Race, Gender, and the Prison Industrial Complex, California and Beyond, featuring this piece that was published in our 20th anniversary reader. Joining me today are Cassandra, Shaylor, and Angela Davis. Before reading an abstract of that piece, I'd like to take a minute to read the bios of Cassandra, Shaylor, and Angela Davis, even though you may all be well aware of who these folks are. Cassandra Schaeler is an activist and attorney based in Oakland, California. She is co-founder of both Critical Resistance and Justice Now, abolitionist organizations focused on dismantling the prison industrial complex and building safe and healthy communities. Her academic and written work has focused on the intersections of race, sexuality, gender, and punishment. Over the past 10 years, she has worked in development for community-based organizations and served as a fundraising and communications consultant for a range of social justice and environmental justice groups. Welcome, Cassandra Schaeler. Angela Y. Davis is a scholar, activist, writer, and distinguished professor emerita of history of consciousness and feminist studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her work as an educator has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. She is the author of 10 books, including Women, Race, and Class, Are Prisons Obsolete?, The Meaning of Freedom and Other Difficult Dialogues, and Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Having helped popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously of the possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. Welcome. And certainly this work that you have both done and that you were gracious enough to share with Meridians in one of its earliest issues, Volume 2, Number 1, in the fall of 2001, is now foundational, formative 20 years on. So I'll read the abstract of the piece just so the audience knows what that particular text was about. And then I'm going to ask you a series of questions, some prompts, and I want to remind everyone that we do have a question button at the bottom. I encourage you to take this opportunity, this, I think, special opportunity to ask questions of Professor Davis and Professor Shaylor. So the abstract of the piece, Race, Gender, and the Prison Industrial Complex, California and Beyond. Despite the transnational growth of the prison industrial complex and the rapid expansion of the carceral state in the United States and beyond, violence against women in prisons has remained largely invisible. Reports from people inside prisons, amplified by activists on the outside and international human rights organizations documenting prison conditions, highlight rampant violations of human rights behind the walls. The gendered nature of racism, which fuels the growth of the prison industrial complex, results in experiences of violence, including medical neglect, sexual abuse, lack of reproductive control, loss of parental rights, and the devastating effects of isolation that manifest in particular ways in women's prisons. Advocates who are challenging conditions are increasingly connecting with activists across the globe and organizing their efforts to resist this violence in concert with a broader resistance to carcerality overall. And your essay, of course, spools out that story and that analysis at length. But before we turn to the substance of your essay, could you please tell us a little bit about how the essay is part of your longer intellectual and personal and professional trajectory, beginning with the work that you did as undergraduates, both of you, and in graduate school, and how you ultimately decided to publish it in Meridians, which was a newcomer on the scholarly journal scene in 2001.
Do you want me to begin?
Sure. I'm having a little fangirl moment, so I'm very, very nervous. I hope I pulled that off. Okay.
Well, we were having a conversation before we went live about the relationship between scholarly research and activism. And I was saying to you, I think that in my entire career, I find it very difficult to separate activist concerns from scholarly concerns. And perhaps that's because I decided to study philosophy precisely because I thought it would be of some use in efforts to transform the world. And everybody, of course, is familiar with Marx's 11th Feuerbach thesis: philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So that has been my framework throughout. The very first article I published in 1971 when I was in jail addressed specifically the issue of women under slavery and the role that enslaved women played in creating the terrain and the very possibility for a liberation movement. So that was the first article. This article was published, was it 2001?
Yes.
And I'll say just a little bit about why Cassandra and I decided to write this together. Of course, Cassandra was involved in Justice Now, but what she didn't say in her bio was that she was also a graduate student. She was working toward her PhD in the Department of the History of Consciousness at UC Santa Cruz, and I was her dissertation advisor. But that's not our only relationship. We have been involved in many activist efforts. We were both co-founders of Critical Resistance, and she can tell you a little bit more. But she wrote a really brilliant dissertation on some of these very issues. So I really relied on her expertise, as we collaboratively wrote this article, which was included as a part of a report that was created by the Women of Color Resource Center in Oakland, a report to the International Conference on Racism that took place in 2001 in Durban, South Africa. Mm. So Cassandra, maybe you can, follow up a bit.
Well, I mean, yeah, just to say, and, thank you for what you shared about me already, Angela, that the work that I was doing at Justice Now was very much about providing legal services to people in women's prisons, training law students to come into prisons and provide that kind of support, but also to be doing organizing work and collaborative work and visioning work with people inside. And to be a really avowedly abolitionist organization. So we were very attentive to the kind of work we were doing with people inside and in and about the system, being work that wasn't about bolstering the system in any way. What people refer to as non-reformist reforms. And I think we'll talk later when we talk about the article more about, that tension between reform and abolition. But yeah, and as Angela mentioned, I was also a graduate student and trying to write about and think about that work that we were doing on the ground and how it could inform then the ways that abolitionist thinking and organizing was being shaped in that period 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, can I say one other thing, which is what I meant to say at the beginning, which is that this is also really like an interesting moment for me because it's a bit of a homecoming in that I am actually a Smith College graduate. So,
that didn't make it into your bio. Okay.
Yeah. So the connection to Meridians, has the special meaning for me in that regard as well. And hard to believe that it's actually been almost 30 years since I was a student at Smith, but it's also been 20 years since we wrote this piece, which feels hard to believe. So,
okay, wait, so that makes you a class of
92.
92. Okay, so we were here together. We were
Angela, when I saw that you were 90, that we would have been there at the same time. Yeah, it's really funny.
That is really funny. Okay, because I was a bit of a rabble rouser, so I wonder if we crossed paths, Cassandra. I'm sure we did. Probably, fostering revolution in the basement of Chapin.
So let me say a few words. You also asked in that question about the reason why we decided to publish this article in the United States in Meridians. We pointed out that it was already a part of this report, United Nations report. And I was aware of Meridians before the first issue was released, because I had come to Smith several times and had a number of extended conversations with Ruth Simmons, who's an old friend. And of course, when she became president at Smith, she began to consider how to guarantee that her presence there was not simply that of a Black woman president of an institution that otherwise remained unchanged. Mm-hmm. So Meridians was designed, I think, to institutionalize the importance of scholarship by and about women of color, and Meridians would serve as a very important peer-reviewed journal that would prioritize their work. So I think of Meridians as an important aspect of the legacy of Ruth Simmons. The Smith College she left when she went on to Brown was not the same institution she joined when she first became when she became the first Black woman president of a predominantly white college. And parenthetically, it may be worth mentioning that the anti-slavery project she started at Brown University was really the fulcrum of important changes there. And there's no doubt in my mind that Prairie View, where she is now in Texas, will likewise reveal major structural changes. Now, there's one other connection to Meridians that I should perhaps remember. I should be completely transparent here. And the inaugural editor of Meridians was Kumkum Bhavnani, whom I met in London when she was associated with a number of organizations of Black women in Britain, where the term Black was an overarching political category embracing people of African, Asian, Middle Eastern descent, and it largely referred to activists who identified with anti-imperialist theories and practices. So Kumkum and I wrote 3 articles together about women in prison, one in the US, one about the Netherlands, and one about Cuba. Of course, I'm not saying that this is why the article was selected, because it did go through the peer-reviewed process, but of course it was one of the reasons why it was submitted. So just a little bit of the backdrop.
I really appreciate you saying that. I don't know if you were able to attend yesterday's opening, Angela, but as you know, Ruth did give an opening keynote address, and we had a founders panel, and those stories and that really important history and that desire on Ruth's part to institutionalize, right, the significance of her presence here, and not just have it be this, footsteps in the sand experience, right, where she's here, there's a sandcastle built, the wave comes and it's gone. And I definitely think it is the case that Meridians has endeavored to remain and continue to be a space that fosters women of color knowledge production and supports the work that women of color knowledge producers are doing, and more importantly, the political vision, right, that is inherent in that, including anti-imperialist transnational politics of solidarity. So yes, it is part of what we endeavor to do, and it's part of why I was so insistent on celebrating this 20th anniversary to mark that work has been done, and that we continue to do it with that vision, that founding core vision in place. So I'm really grateful that you take us back to that history. So can we turn now and not, our audience in suspense anymore to the actual substance of the article, where you very adeptly and aptly connect, right, these long histories to the moment that you were writing in, 2001, the turn of that period, and then to this one, and where, the ongoing nature, and now the newly developed nature of privatized prisons. Maybe we're having an opportunity to undo that, who knows? But so the substance of the essay, talk to us about that, and where are we now with these questions of the carceral state and the abolition movement?
Well, I can speak to that first, and Angela, I'm sure will have much to say. I mean, what we know about the prison industrial complex is that, it's nothing if not a shapeshifter. So I wouldn't say that the foundational analysis itself has changed over the 20 years from when we wrote that piece to now. But I think over time we've sharpened our ways of thinking and talking to respond to that shifting nature. So how we think and talk about gender, for instance, and about what truly abolitionist work is, and maybe more importantly, what it isn't. And we've refined our strategies in response to it that call on us to be nimble and creative, in this like dance that we're in with the state. Or what we committed to at Critical Resistance 25 years ago, which was to be fresh and radical. Those were our the words that we chose. And one thing I do want to say sort of up front, that one of the things that certainly jumps out and looking back at the article is that, since then we've developed a much more expansive way of talking about gender. And it's interesting to map that within a short time after the publication of this article, actually, we shifted, for instance, to talking about people in women's prisons as opposed to women in prison, to acknowledge trans and non-binary folks who are forced into institutions based on their assignation at birth, and to be more expansive overall in our thinking about the category of woman. And I think it's important to acknowledge how much of that growth in our thinking had so much to do with collaborative relationships with organizations like the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, or TGI-JP, the Transgender Gender Variant People in Prison Project here in the Bay Area. And I also think we've spent a lot of time over the last 20 years, not only refining our answers to the hard questions about how to challenge the prison industrial complex, how to be an abolitionist, but also to interrogate the questions themselves. We've been learning how to ask new questions and encourage other people to do that. Like, what work do prisons and police actually do? Like, what is the world we want to build? What do we really mean when we say we want accountability? Do the responses we currently have actually get us closer to that? Yeah. And as I mentioned before, for 20 years, more than 20 years, actually, since really the advent of the prison, there's been this constant tension between reform and liberation. And our attention to that hasn't changed. We have to stay vigilant about and committed to responses that continue to move us in the direction of an end to the carceral state and the creation of what we want instead, and to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of advocating for reforms that ultimately strengthen and expand carcerality in the guise of community-based strategies. And I mean, these conversations are ongoing. Like, we're still talking about, new versions of this, whether it's gender responsive prisons, which is about expanding the number of institutions and the number of people in those institutions in the guise of a nicer version of a prison that's specifically designed for women, or if it's ankle monitors to extend, the reach of the state into the home, or most recently in response to police violence, calls for body cameras or more Black police officers. As if that will change a system that's actually doing exactly what it is designed to do. that I was thinking about the something that Robin Kelly says about how quickly reforms become common sense, and which means then that they become entrenched and so much harder to eliminate. And that, you know, I think it's important to note that those aren't new questions or concerns. We've been wrestling with them for years. And as activist educator Erica Miner says, we need deeper genealogies of this political moment, so we're aware of that history and avoid retreading the same political minefields and questions, and more effectively stay ahead of the state in order to completely move resources out of the carceral context. And then I'll just say, and I think Angela's going to speak to this too, that, you know, certainly arguably the most remarkable change over these last years, which feels like it's happened mostly in the last few years, but especially in the last year at a rate that's been really hard to even absorb, is the number of people who are taking up the idea of abolition, like to an extent that we never could have imagined 20 years ago. And that doesn't require a new analysis as much as it calls on us to be very clear about what abolition means. And not because, you know, we're interested in being gatekeepers, but because as exciting as this moment is and as rich as it is with possibility, we really want to be clear about the specificity of abolition as a vision and a strategy, that it means eliminating the carceral state and structural oppression that supports it, and opposing reforms that strengthen it, being really clear about what those are, and also proliferating all the things we know keep us happy, healthy, safe, and strong. And I guess just one other thing I'll say on that is thinking about abolition as a practice of imagination, of making the connection between liberation and imagination. And I was thinking about the fact that 20 years ago, at Justice Now, we were going into the Central California Women's Facility and Valley State Prison for Women, the latter of which no longer imprisons women, actually, because of work to stem the tide of prison expansion and reduce the prison population. But at that time, there were 2 women's prisons in the Central Valley across the street from each other. And we worked on a project where we were collaborating with people inside to imagine a world without prisons, to imagine what that space of the prison that they were currently occupying could be instead. And it wasn't easy. Like, what we found was that at first it was a struggle to come up with true alternatives to the PIC. All of the ideas were really constrained by the idea of the current system about what could make it more tolerable, or what tweaks could be made so that fewer people died or fewer people lost their kids, and what would we do about the fact that people would still harm each other. But over time, a really powerful shift happened when we committed ourselves to believing that this, like what we have now, is not inevitable, and to recognizing that we actually already know what we need. Like, it isn't such a leap. Like, you know, we know we need housing and food security and clean water and education and access to nature and art and healthcare, all those things that, you know, so many people are currently denied access to because of structural oppression, including capitalism. So anyway, I have some other things, but I'll stop there. I've said a lot, and I'm sure Angela has much to say as well.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Well, you know, what I'll say is that I don't necessarily like rereading things that I wrote long ago. Because I know that I'm reading with new eyes, and I ask myself, well, why didn't I include this? Well, that was a stupid thing to say. But I have to admit, I had a lot of fun rereading this, and it reminds me of the environment at that time. It reminds me, first of all, that although this was a collaborative effort between the 2 of us, it represented a much larger community of activists, intellectuals. These were ideas that were generated collectively and collaboratively. And I remember that at the time we had to defend the decision to engage in this kind of research if we were not criminologists. Of course, Cassandra is an attorney, but of course, this research is not simply legal research. And we had to actually make arguments as to why an interdisciplinary approach to issues of imprisonment and women's imprisonment was necessary. And I can remember when I proposed to give talks around prison issues during that period of time, sometimes people would be really disappointed. Why are you going to talk about prisons? What does that have to do with anything? And of course, there was also a reluctance to move beyond the whole notion of crime and punishment. Those who were in prison were assumed to be criminals, and therefore they were assumed to be the people from whom we had to protect ourselves. And Cassandra will remember, even people who had family members in prison were reluctant to publicly engage with this issue. And so as I realized that 20 years have passed, an enormous number of changes have occurred. It's one can see many scholarly and popular articles on imprisonment. We now have an academic field that we've called critical prison studies that is interdisciplinary. And I think that interdisciplinarity is something that we really have to hold on to because it requires us to perhaps think even more deeply about the connection between our scholarly research, our activist interventions, and the possibilities of radical revolutionary change in the world. So when I reread the article, I was thinking about these things and realizing that actually we have made a difference. And when I say we, I'm talking about all of us who have these concerns, academics, advocates, artists, and I don't think in the beginning we really felt that we were going to have this kind of impact. And as Cassandra pointed out, that we've really seen major changes over the last period. And I've been saying that as I welcome all of these amazing transformations, it occurs to me that I imagine such transformations as perhaps happening long after most of us would be absent from the earth. We were working for an abolitionist future, and we didn't believe that the work we were doing was going to have such immediate consequences. And the fact that it did, I think, reinforces something that I've said many times. We have to act as if it is really possible to change the world. We never know when conjunctures will emerge, such as the conjuncture that was produced by the confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the awareness of structural racism and all of the massive demonstrations that took place around the cases of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. So I'm in a lot of ways, I'm really proud of this article because I can see now that it helped to make a difference. And particularly, as Cassandra was pointing out, around the issues of gender and now the fact that we recognize how important it is to consider gender, not in a narrow sense, but rather in the capacious sense in which the trans movement and gender non-conforming movement has demonstrated.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I think so often for those of us who are working inside the walls of the academy and the ivory tower, even those of us who are feminists and women of color scholars who have these political commitments, both, you know, in our work, but also in our pedagogy and in our fuller community lives and identities, sometimes we wonder, right? We wonder if this work, and I hear it from my students, particularly first generation students, students of color, who are often feeling like being here in the classroom is a betrayal of folks they left back home, and they're trying to make sense of, you know, is this investment that I'm making in this education and reading these books and learning these theories and these histories, does it matter? Right? What is it for? What does it mean? And I think that also sometimes is the case for those of us who become academics and scholars, and wondering, like, is this really where my best efforts go? And what difference will it make? And so hearing you say that, to affirm, because in my introduction to the 20th anniversary reader, I took a little bit of credit as part of that larger community of women of color feminist scholars for this summer, in the sense that I felt that it was a kind of coming to fruition, and that conservative right wingers are right, that the academy and higher education is fomenting revolution. Right? That we have been teaching students to transgress for 50 years now, especially with the rise of ethnic studies and women's studies and all the other studies, right? And that is what we have been doing, planting those seeds and shifting those ways of thinking, and, you know, rejecting common sense and fostering radical visions. And that, you know, Meridians certainly has been part of that project. And so, you know, when we saw all these people in the street, including white people, right? Including men, including the folks who supposedly these systems were built for, saying no, right? No, you know, enough of this. It did feel like a tiny bit of success, right? So I appreciate you echoing that and saying that also, Angela. And so I'd like to bring us back. Tell us, what success have you seen? Like, what is it that you're referring to when you say, look, it looks like something is happening now? Could you tell us more about that? Walk us down that road with you.
Well, I can start. I mean, one of the things that I noticed in looking back at the list of recommendations that we had at the end of the article was exactly that, like how many successes there have been in the last 20 years that have been a result of committed abolitionist practice. I mean, that were a result of work that's been done over a long time. And I want to say it's like, you know, to Angela's point about like the sort of surprise of this moment for us, having been, you know, in spaces where abolition was, you know, presented as and understood to be a utopian vision. I mean, this is the word that people used, you know, and now it's, you know, potentially anyway, an actual practice, you know, that will proliferate, has the potential to do that, given, you know, the energy around it now. But, just that, you know, that, and it's only, I guess, reiterating the point, but like that didn't happen in a vacuum. Like it's built on work that's been done for decades and before, you know, that allowed us to get to this moment. But anyway, in terms of the successes, I would just say, you know, we've seen them in really profound ways in stopping prison expansion, in interrupting jail construction, in opposing gender responsive approaches, and, you know, as we've been talking about, making common sense the possibility of abolition. And in that list, we included this focus on preventing prison construction and on decarceration strategies. And an example of that came to mind recently because I was in Joshua Tree National Park in Southern California, and one of the critters that lives there is the California kangaroo rat. And back in the early 2000s, at the height of prison expansion in California, there was a plan to build a second prison in the rural town of Delano, California. And that prison construction was delayed because of a very creative legal strategy that a broad coalition of something like, I don't know, 30, I think, anti-prison and farm worker and environmental rights groups, led by a phenomenal activist and lawyer, Rose Braz, who was the director of Critical Resistance at the time, devised. And the lawsuit hinged on the failure of the state to adequately consider the environmental impact of the prison, including to the endangered Tipton kangaroo rat. The lawsuit was called the Friends of the Kangaroo Rat versus the state of California. And it was successful at delaying the construction of the prison for several years. And I offer that, as an example of the creativity and the, commitment of activists doing abolitionist work, so much of which was the result of brilliant strategizing, but also the on the ground, day by day, individual relationship building and organizational alliance building that, was really the basis on which that was successful. And another example is the recent attempt to expand the LA County Jail. And I'm being very California specific. That's where I am. That was billed as this multi-billion-dollar project that was billed as a mental health treatment facility, which, because of years of political education and organizing, was defeated by activists in LA. And it's just, again, I think important to name how that work and this current moment of a profound shift in the culture to embrace the idea of abolition is because of the work of decades of organizing, especially by Black women and other feminist networks and multiracial and multi-issue alliances, which is labor that, often doesn't get acknowledged. And I think it's really important to say that, like, we're here because of those networks and formations and collectives, like the work of so many people, not of individuals.
Yeah, and I would add I remember now, Cassandra, the Friends of the Kangaroo Rat. That was really remarkable, and thank you also for bringing up Rose Braz's name, who's no longer with us. She was an absolutely brilliant organizer, lawyer, a proponent of creativity and the imagination. I wanted to say a few words about the ways in which this work has helped to introduce feminism to new communities and to emphasize the importance of a feminism that is anti-racist and anti-capitalist. Many years ago, those of us who did work around women in prison, or what we later came to call people in women's prisons, were criticized because the assumption was there were so few women in prison. If we wanted to have an impact on the carceral system, why not deal with the larger issues? In other words, why not deal with men in prison? Because men constituted the overwhelming majority of people behind bars. And so in the course of doing this work, the intellectual work, the organizing work, the research, we've had to emphasize what I think is now a very important part of feminist theory, that we can't rely on quantitative measures to determine what is important, what is significant. And I think we've been able to demonstrate that by examining the experiences of women behind bars, we're able to develop the kind of framework that has an impact on the entire system in ways that would not be possible if we excluded women's prisons. For example, what now has become, rather widely accepted, the relationship between intimate violence and state violence. This was one of the first examples of demonstrating the ways in which intimate violence or domestic violence, which is the term we use then, is connected to state violence. And so the article that we wrote actually, I think, represents some earlier versions of the analysis of the connection between domestic abuse and systematic racist, misogynist violence by the state. And some of the examples in this article, I think I'd forgotten some of them, and I see how powerful they are. And this dynamic also was important in the decision to focus a great deal of attention to issues of gender nonconforming people behind bars, trans people and gender nonconforming people, because in doing this analysis, we learned that it wasn't only about the particular individuals, but rather it was about the processes of the state, the ideological processes of the state, and that we could actually, again, think about the prison as an ideological apparatus. If we think about Althusser's notion of repressive apparatuses and ideological apparatuses, that we can see the prison as both a repressive apparatus of the state and an ideological apparatus of the state, in that it insists on a kind of gender binary to be etched in stone, which not only affects those who are inside, but it affects those on the outside as well. So that we came up with a number of insights that demonstrated how important it is to use feminist analyses here. And as I look now and I see that not only are scholars and activists, regardless of their gender identification, relying on feminist approaches, but also activists increasingly use feminist methodologies in their organizing. So it's quite wonderful to see, not only the people who identify as women who are involved in Black Lives Matter, for example, refer to themselves as feminists, but also male-identified organizers are feeling very comfortable in referring to themselves as, anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminists. So I was just thinking about this in terms of the larger picture, and the article and so many other aspects of our work help to generate this kind of insight.
So there are two questions in the question box, but I'm going to allow myself one more question before I turn to those, which is to this point that you're making, and to pick up a thread that you raised earlier, Cassandra, around the importance of imaginaries. And you also mentioned the Silvia Rivera Law Center, which I know was a project that Dean Spade was heavily involved in. We had the privilege of having Dean Spade join us for a faculty seminar here in the Study of Women and Gender program. And one of the greatest challenges, I would say, that Dean had with us, the faculty who were in that seminar, was getting us to imagine an alternative to police departments, for example, to calling on the police when something happens, and really how we struggled with, what would we do instead, right? And thinking that moment, which was I think 6-7 years ago now, to this moment where defund the police is now again part of the public conversation, and abolition is part of the public conversation. Like, what help us again with the structures of imagination, to your point about the repressive and apparatus. It works most fully in our own imaginations, right? In our own minds, right? So imagining, what does this other world that you are working towards, that we are working towards, what does it look like, right? What is in place of that prison that was going to be cited in that space, right? What is in place of calling the police, who then come and murder our children, right, when they're called upon? Like, so share that vision with us, please. And then I'm going to go ahead and ask out loud the question that's in the box. But I really want to give an opportunity for your imagination to be drawn out, literally, for us.
Well, can I say, I mean, one thing that comes to mind, which doesn't exactly get, straight to your question, but is, and I think I alluded to it earlier, there's a need to ask different questions. Like, why is it that we, or even if we ask ourselves the question, like, if I call the police, will the outcome be what I'm hoping it will be? Like, what we see over and over again is that it isn't. Like, we don't get what we think we're going to, or we hope we're going to get. So why do we keep, imagining that that's actually going to lead us to something that's helpful? Like you said, the police come, then they murder someone. And there was another thing I was going to say that I think will come back to me in a minute. Yeah. I don't actually.
I'm just remembering that that 25 or so years ago, there had been very little public support for engaging in anti-prison activism, whereas police brutality, racist police brutality, was much more, widely acknowledged. As a matter of fact, I can chart my entire trajectory as an activist looking at cases involving racist police violence. So we thought then that that there was a much more widespread consciousness about the structural racism within police departments than there was about prisons. Prisons were considered to be entirely invisible. So that as focusing on prison issues, I think that we were also recognizing that the whole carceral set of carceral institutions had to be taken into consideration, including the police. So that I think many of us were really surprised that when abolition became a part of public discourse, it was much more connected to the police than to prisons. But of course, there's an organic connection here that we have to retain. The point that I wanted to make, and it's sort of following up from the discussion about feminism, but also addressing the question about what to do in lieu of calling the police, is what I wanted to point out is that another organization called Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, was created in the aftermath of the creation of critical resistance by a number of activists, both within CR and outside. And it's also interesting that a number of those activists came from the University of California, Santa Cruz. I mean, I'm not pushing UCSC, but the idea for critical resistance was hatched on that campus when Cassandra and I and a couple of other people got together and began to talk about what we could do to bring people together who were doing work around prisons and against all of the issues that we recognize then related to prisons. At the same time, 2 years later, a conference took place on the campus called The Color of Violence. And I wanted to be sure to mention this because an article was published in Meridians immediately after the conference about the operations of conference. I mentioned is if people are interested, they might look at a statement that was jointly written by Critical Resistance and Insight that addresses addresses a range of issues relating to the connection between state violence and intimate violence. And if one looks at the Insight website, as well as the CR website, there are many very creative suggestions about how to begin to create health and safety and security without automatically relying on the police, without relying on police and prisons. In many ways, we've become de-skilled, and we assume that if something goes wrong, we have to call the police. That's an impulse that is inscribed into our own, individual emotional constitution. And we have to figure out how to fight that. And at the same time, recognize that as we are attempting to fight a world where prisons and police don't represent ways of addressing them in our society, that as a matter of fact, we need a revolutionary, new revolutionary transformations. We need healthcare. We need housing. We need free education. There's so many things we need. So that the question is about not focusing myopically on the issue of the police or the prisons, but asking ourselves, how can we transform our society so that we no longer have to rely on these terribly repressive institutions. And so now for the time being, we talk about restorative justice. We talk about transformative justice. How can we envision justice that is not retributive, but rather is transformative and restorative?
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think that one of the things that abolition lends itself to, and that we've developed more of an analysis of over time, is thinking of abolition as also an intimate practice, that it's a way of being in relationship with each other, and our focus being on non-harming in our interactions with each other, on nonviolent communication, on and requires us to ask how we show up with each other in organizing spaces, in community, in our homes, in intimate relationships. That one way to think about it is as a way to challenge a culture of punishment and a focus on a kind of win-lose binary and dominance, and on the ways of being that we've absorbed, like Angela was saying, it's like just the impulse now, that we've absorbed over centuries from a violent culture that we're part of. And if we can, turn to looking at how these ways of thinking inform our ways of being with each other, then we're forging relationships in ways that we don't have to rely on the police anymore, because we have within our communities ways to respond that, keep us actually healthy and safe in a way that, the police never have.
What you're reminding me of, one of the earlier panels today had Kamala Price on it, and her essay was on reproductive justice. And in so many ways, this is what we're talking about, right? Is this kind of reproductive justice framing that moves beyond, choice, right? And a focus on abortion, but really on this larger politics of what activists in Latin America are calling buen vivir, good life, right? Not the good life in the sense of, Robin Williams champagne and yachts, but like well-being, right? The life that fosters true human well-being. Angela, I don't know if you're aware, your camera's off. I think we're having a problem with your internet connection, but I'd like us to continue the conversation and hope that you can come back and join us. I think she's going to probably log back in. Cassandra, while that's happening, let me ask you to.
Excuse me, am I back in now?
You're here.
You are, but we can't see you on screen. So let's see. There you are. Okay, excellent. Wonderful. I was just saying that when you were talking about restorative justice, redistributive justice, I finished the sentence in my mind with reproductive justice, right? Because it's a similar vision, right, around how to foster human life in its fullest sense, right, and how small, again, our imaginations have become in the context of the carceral state that we are brought up in, like literally, and that we have moved through, right? So offering these radical alternative visions of what justice is and how we can contribute to that project of radically revisioning through our work as educators, as writers, as scholars, and as activists. So one of the questions I sent you in advance was, and highlighting that I purposely timed the conference to coincide with International Workers' Day weekend. Originally, I was hoping that we would have this conversation tomorrow on that day, but in some ways, I think it's even better that we're having it today because it's the last conference of our day, our last panel. So we can go a little over if you're willing to stay with us. And I want to ask you to reflect on these questions in the international realm, because I know your work has always been international. Angela, for sure. I know, Cassandra, you were saying, I'm so California-based. That's okay, right? We start from where we are, but we always think out. And I know that you also think globally. So I want to ask us to take us to the global context for this work that you do and have been doing, the transnational context, the international. These are not all the same thing, right? The global, the international, and the transnational. And I just want to say very quickly, Angela, I don't know if you're aware, we named a prize in honor of Paula Giddings, the Paula J. Giddings Best Article Award in Meridians. And the winner of the first prize was Miglena Todorova, who wrote an essay called Race and Women of Color in Post-Socialist and Socialist Transnational Feminisms in Central and Southeastern Europe. And she wrote about how your visit to Bulgaria inspired a Romani activist in 1972, and how the frame that you brought, the frame for thinking politically, inspired this activist and the activists and the movement that she was a part of. So I wanted to make sure I asked you that question about the international, transnational, and global nature of your work, always already, but especially in this topic of carcerality and the state.
Wow, this is the last question, and we only have a few minutes. And of course, it's the beginning of another extremely important conversation. I did not know about the article on by the Bulgarian woman. I need to find it. Perhaps someone will put it in the. I'm
going to make sure to send it to email it.
And well, first of all, the impact of the work that was done, say 20, 25, 30, 40 years ago on the present has encouraged me to go back and think more deeply about our historical roots and the historical roots of formations and activists who considered themselves feminist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and of course internationalists. So I'm actually teaching a course on feminism in the Black radical tradition at UCLA right now, at a graduate seminar in which we are examining activists so many activists, Shirley Graham Du Bois, for example, Ella Baker, the Sojourners for Freedom, and many others. But what is the common denominator of all of them? Claudia Jones, of course, I should mention Claudia Jones, is internationalism. And it's my thinking that that this is the piece that's missing now. I mean, missing because we have the capacity to engage in so much more interchange across national borders. Back in the day when, for example, the campaign around my case was organized, and then when I traveled to Bulgaria, all of our communication was by snail mail. Mm-hmm. Yet it was possible to have this really, vibrant sense of what was happening around the world. Of course, there was a structure of communist parties, and that is we no longer have that same structure, but we do know that we can learn a great deal from what is happening in other places. And I'm specifically saying we in the US because of the tendency toward a kind of provincialism that is encouraged by American exceptionalism. For example, Brazil, we're in the midst of this enormous campaign against the racist structures within the police, and we're calling for the abolition of the police. We're challenging the militarization of the police, and we can learn a lot from Brazil, where, of course, we have the example of Marielle Franco, but there are huge numbers of Black women in Brazil who have been doing this work forever, and it's often very ironic that when in Brazil they begin to talk about Black feminism, they look toward the U.S. Whereas they should be looking at their own history, and we should be learning, from the histories of Brazil. Anyway, that's a long story. I'll tell you that that tomorrow I'm speaking at a rally that is organized by the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union that came into being. I don't know the precise history, but I think probably 75 years ago, there was a major strike in San Francisco. Harry Bridges, for example, was at the forefront of that. The ILWU did a lot of work around my case. The ILWU is now one of the most important organizations in the fight to free Mumia Abu-Jamal. And that is one of the themes of the demonstration tomorrow. So I'm really looking forward to being with those who are calling not only for an end to the police, but also an end to capitalism. Because sometimes we don't make the connection. And what we're really saying is that if we really will be able in the future to abolish the police, to abolish prisons, it will no longer be within the context of a capitalist society. But it's also to say that we can't just abstractly call for an end to capitalism and expect heteropatriarchy to disappear as a result, and expect carcerality to disappear. So I'm really looking forward to spending my morning tomorrow with workers, workers of all genders, of all racial backgrounds, who are calling for an end to capitalism.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to, I'm glad you mentioned Black Brazilian women's organizing, because as it happens, our very first panel tomorrow is featuring Black feminists from Brazil, Black Brazilian feminists and their march. And the photojournalist who documented their march and shared that documentation with us in Meridians. So that
was an amazing march. Oh, yes. My God. It's and if anyone has been to Brazil to experience the enthusiasm and the conviction that change can happen, even now under the worst of circumstances with the person with Bolsonaro. I won't say anything else about that, but but yeah, it's wonderful to be inspired by our sister comrades in Brazil.
And it was always integrative, right? It's also always interactions. Cassandra, would you like to take this question up about the internationalism and the globalism and transnationalism, and then I'll circle back and ask you both for your final thoughts, or maybe I'll ask Cassandra your final thoughts, and I'll let, if you don't mind, Angela, having the final words for us to close our day today. But Cassandra.
Sure. I mean, I don't know that I have, much to add other than what I was sitting here thinking about is the ways in which we find in doing organizing work across international borders, the similarities that exist in the structures, in the demographics, in the outcomes. And for instance, Justice Now historically did a lot of work with Sisters Inside, which is an organization in Australia that similarly is an abolitionist organization and works with people in prisons there. And, the ways in which we benefited from a feeling of solidarity because we were dealing with very similar issues, and also the ways in which we could learn from each other, creative strategies and new frameworks. So I completely agree with Angela that there's a way in which there's so much opportunity here to do more, especially given technology, and just wanting to lift up the fact that there are these connections that happen. And again, we see the impact of U.S. imperialism in what gets shared around the world from our model of prison and policing. So I guess that's maybe all I'll say.
All right, and I just want to use the last minute or so to thank Meridians and to thank you, Ginetta, for your work as editor. And I know, Paula Giddings. I've known Paula Giddings forever and ever and ever, and I know that she was the editor for how many years? For 15 years or so.
12 years, yep.
12 years, okay. And I want to thank you for including our article. It was a surprise because there've been, of course, over the last 20 years, really remarkable, brilliant articles. So we're so happy to be in the company in which you placed us. Ruth Simmons, of course, and I mentioned Kumkum Bhavnani and Paula Giddings, whom I've known forever. And I also noticed that two of my students, actually 3 students, are in the issue. Crystal Zook,
excellent. No kidding.
Crystal Zook, Luz Calvo, and Joanne Barker were all at UC Santa Cruz. And of course, Ahmed, who's a good friend, and Sonia Alvarez taught at UC Santa Cruz around that time. I really didn't. I didn't plan this, but I'm just recognizing that so many of the authors have that connection. And then Daphne Brooks and Vivian May. I mean, it's such an amazing issue. Thank you so much for putting it together. And I hope that the next 20 years will be as productive and as exciting for Meridians as the first 20.
Thank you so much. I'm not surprised that those connections exist. I'm so thrilled to hear that we have you in common in that way, and that these solidarities are manifest in our relationships, in our work, and in this issue. That's so wonderful to hear. Thank you so much. Sonia will be leading that session on Black Brazilian feminist women movement tomorrow morning, and I'm just so grateful. I'm so grateful that you were able to make the time to join us. I'm so happy to learn that we're classmates of Smithies in Comments. Cassandra, thank you for sharing that connection as well. And thank you for contributing your work to Meridians and lending your support to our ongoing effort to plant those seeds and to water them and help them grow across the world.
Thank you. And big thanks to Megan also for holding all of the tech and all of the logistics and all of that work that is often invisible. So much appreciation. And
our student interns are also behind the scenes making all the curtains work properly. So thank you for that. Happy May Day. Right? International workers of the world. We know what we got to do, right? Yeah. Thank you so much. Happy Friday. Good night to you all.
Bye. Thank you.